Now, let's talk with former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. He is now Senior Fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center. He hosts the World Review with Ivo Daalder podcast. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. What do you think about what obviously Caroline Leavitt is signaling there ahead of this meeting and what this indicates for how this meeting is going to go?
Well, it doesn't bode well. I mean, in one sentence, three mistakes made. The NATO countries did not turn their backs on the American people. The United States, under Donald Trump, decided to go to war against Iran without telling or informing, let alone consulting the NATO allies that they were going to do that. The U.S. used U.S. bases in Europe in order to conduct that operation without interference, without any issue. Without those bases, the United States couldn't have conducted the war in the last 5.5 weeks. And so the question of whether NATO is an institution, which is a defensive alliance that has only once invoked its collective security provision, which was to defend the United States after 9/11. There's just so much wrong in what the president says that it's deeply worrisome. I do hope that Secretary General Mark Rutte can put the president right, that NATO actually has been an incredibly supportive alliance of the United States. Well over 1,000 people fighting in Afghanistan in order to support American security died as a result of that. And for the president to continue to say that NATO is a one-way street, that somehow NATO does not serve American security, let alone that the U.S. taxpayer is the one that is funding NATO. All of that's wrong, and it's just not. It just really doesn't help the situation that we're in right now.
Of course, you know, his reference point is normally himself, right? For his term in office and how he sees NATO serving that versus how NATO may have served America in the past. And Leavitt said that Trump may discuss withdrawing from NATO. Are you seeing this as any different from past rhetoric that's anti-NATO coming from the Trump administration?
I do. I mean, clearly the rhetoric has ratcheted up. I mean, Donald Trump has never liked NATO for as long as he's been talking about NATO for the better part of 3 or 4 decades. He believes wrongly that NATO is a burden rather than a benefit to the United States. All of his predecessors disagree with him, back all the way to Harry S. Truman, who of course was president when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed 77 years ago. But the rhetoric has changed. The rhetoric is now talking about withdrawal in a way that even in the first term didn't happen, although there were internal discussions about this. And more worrisome even than what the president is saying, because we know the president's view, is that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State / National Security Advisor, is now also raising questions about NATO. The same alliance that in 2023, when he was in the Senate, he said and got the Senate to agree that no president should ever be in a position to withdraw from NATO, which is why he sponsored and got approved an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that says that the president cannot withdraw from NATO without 2/3 of the Senate's approval. And yet this same Marco Rubio is now raising serious questions about NATO. Secretary Hegseth, when asked whether the United States would fulfill its commitment, Article 5, which, by the way, every NATO country did on 9/11, refused to answer that question. So, yes, I think we're in a dire straits. We're in a situation which I've characterized as the worst crisis NATO has faced in 77 years.
Obviously, a lot hanging in the balance for this meeting. Ambassador Ivo Daalder, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Brianna.